Is this a bowl or a platter? Well, it doesn't matter because in this week's video, I'm going to show you how to make this out of 4 pounds of clay in a nice and easy way that's beginner friendly. So if that's something that you want to see, stick around and find out how we make this bowl platter thingy. Alright, we got our 4-pound ball set up. Let's go ahead and get this set up to throw our wide bowl, or what I like to call a platter, but I guess I was told it's not a platter. But anyway, let's get this ready, roll it around, get it stuck. And just like the bowl video, if you watch that, I slap center this to get it stuck. And it just helps me do the whole centering process a little quicker. And that's just by tapping it at a nice even rhythm and spinning the wheel not too fast. And this outer edge, you can see it's very off, so then I can just manually push that into center. So squeeze centering. Ooh, it got angry at me. Squeeze centering. And then continue to tap center. And then top section's pretty good. Let's go ahead and get the rest nice and centered. Seal the edge. Get the clay nice and hydrated. And then we'll do the push down, get it stuck. And then we'll do a cone up. Squeezing that base, get all that unevenness to rise upwards. You can see that it does have some wobbliness to it. There's a skirt here that's slightly uneven, so we'll remove that. Get rid of some clay, just toss it into our little bowl of goodies off camera. And then we're going to go ahead and do the cone down again. So slow the wheel down, it's about 3rd speed. And then the setup. Just like the bowl, you want to get this to roughly how wide you want the base to be. Now it can be a little wider because you can always just squeeze it inward a little bit. But if you go too wide, then you're going to have a really wide base. And then your clay walls aren't going to be as dramatic, not as flared out. And so I like it around 5-ish inches. So from here to here is around 5 inches. So it's around 5.5, maybe 6. But this is a good setup. And now for the rest, we're going to go ahead and start digging our well. We have a lot of slip buildup, so that's perfect. We can stop adding water for the time being. So digging our well with our thumbs, pushing down. And this is the way that I like doing it and the way I teach how to dig the well. Another way that you may have seen in the other videos, you can push down with your right hand, brace with your left, or flip. Just keep in mind, this uses a lot more surface area on the outside, so you will need to keep your hands a little more lubricated with either slip or water. And then depth-wise, I'm aiming for that 1/2 inch thick bottom. So that's my standard on what I dig for most of the things I throw. Alright, so now that I got my depth, I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And so that's where I do the pinch method, the pinch and pull. So I'm going to shift my body so that you can see this a little better. So now this is my midnight. And when I open, I initially kind of pinch like this to get it a little narrower, and then I sneak my pointer finger out to then support the outside clay wall. So it looks something like this, where I start to pull the opening outwards. So my pointer finger at the bottom pulling towards me. And then if you need the sponge to support, the sponge would be on the outside supporting the base of the clay. And then I can add some more water at this time. So now that the clay is a little narrower, I can drape my pointer finger over the outside edge. This allows the clay walls to stay more compressed between the 2 fingers. And then when this webbing can touch the top, it compresses the top here to make this, if it does go off center, kind of stay more or less centered. And so my side of my middle finger is pulling towards my body. So it pulls like this, then I squeeze and I lift. And then my right hand pushes in. So basically the mechanics, when I open, bring my middle finger towards my body, compress, then start squeezing in with both fingers and my thumb, and then my sponge hand will increase the pressure at the base to then compress that to make it rise. So right now, my middle finger starting to open the well. You can see from the overhead cam. Actually, I'm going to adjust that right there. So I just did some slight adjustment, add some water. It's opening the well. Then I'm going to start compressing at the base here. And as it opens, the clay is going to start rising. The slip or the water is starting to get removed. So I'm going to add a little more slip before I do the final open and pull. And you can see that there's already a flare occurring. I'm going to push this base in a little more, and that way I can really maximize the clay from the bottom on the first pull. So here we go. So I'm still considering this to open. And then right there, that looks good. Okay, starting to create some drag, so add some water. So here we go. This is the first official pull. Compress the bottom, and then now both hands start moving upwards. And this is a little on the faster side. I don't have my foot on the pedal, so I can't slow it down. But right there, I'm going to actually slow it down, take my pressure off, and release. But you can see that first pull, I got it pretty tall, about twice as tall as it originally was. And because this is going to be a very wide bowl, I want to make sure that my rim stays more or less on the thicker side, because it will flare out to almost 12 to 14 inches depending on how thin I get the base. So I'm going to adjust the pedal now so it's a little more underneath me. And then the first thing I'm going to do, I don't want this to flare out too much because I still got to pull the wall up. So I'm going to do a collar where I make 2 C's, squeeze in, thumbs up, and I kind of tilt my wrist forward, squeeze inward, and lift up. So start at the middle sections right here, and then working my way up. I can feel the clay creating drag against my hand, so I really need to either lubricate it or add slip, just so that I don't throw it off center with the speed of the wheel dragging against the surfaces of my hand. Alright, so now that this cylinder for the first pull is pretty set up, I'm going to go ahead and do a few more pulls to get a little more volume, a little more height, and thickness wise at the rim I want to keep this about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. So I don't want this to thin out too much. So now I'm going to start the traditional pull, the push out, push in, and pull up, sponge on the outside hand. But the first thing I got to address from the overhead cam, you can see right here is where my base meets my wall. It's creating a slope. So I'm going to go ahead and push that outwards. So I'm going to use a sponge to help me with this. So I got to reset my base and my floor because it got a little off as I opened and pulled the piece. So compressing, I can compress this a little more after I open and flare this outwards to the large bowl, but I just want to get that kind of going. Let's throw a little water at the base. So I'm going to be pushing that clay outwards. Okay, my inside hand is like this, pushing out, pushing in, and pulling up. There we go. So this is my 3 o'clock right here. So you can see my pull hand. So pushing out, create the bump, push in underneath the bump, and then compress the clay together, and then I start the pull. And I want the base to be fairly thin because that's not going to stretch out too much. But as I increase in height, I want to decrease in pressure, and I want to ensure that this top section remains more or less the thickness that you see, so that 3/4 to 1/2 inch. Now there can be some taper where it's thinner here, thicker here, and that's fine because as you stretch it outwards, the clay gets distributed. So if you have a nice taper, in theory, the clay should more or less stay the same thickness. And that created a lot of slip on my last pull. So let's go ahead and get that on top. And I definitely want to get this a little thinner, a little taller, so I can get this wider. So I'm going to go ahead and do my second pull. Or in this case, my third pull, since the first one was an open end pull. So same thing. Get the inside a little wet at the bottom. So I'm going to start with the push out on the inside. And then my elbow that's off camera, it's at a nice 90-degree angle. So it looks kind of like this, 90 degree pushing out. So pushing out, you can see the bump form right there. And I do a push in. And then I can do the pull. So I'm focusing on getting this bottom a lot thinner so I can get some more height. Sorry for that bell that's ringing. Release the pressure right there and continue to rise. Okay, more slip. Let's get the piece coated. And I think it's break now. So let's go ahead and pause the video here and continue after break ends. All right, so before we start the final few pulls, I kind of want to go over roughly why I am throwing a cylinder and not throwing it wider as I pull. When you throw anything, you can do a pull and a shape at the same time. It is a little more technical, so it requires a little more practice. For something that is as wide as this bowl that we're about to make, as a beginner or someone who's first trying this technique, I always recommend you start from a cylinder and then you shape from there, because there's just more things that can go wrong if you start combining techniques like a pull and open at the same time. So I'm just letting you guys know there are many ways to throw this form more efficiently, but we're going for the more easier way that's tried and true, and it's really easy to replicate because the muscle memory is a little more familiar. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and start doing our final few pulls, but I want to check for clay thickness first. And so the way I like doing it, you may have seen it in other videos, but you take your needle, you stab it in from the sidewall, and when it touches your inside finger, you grab the needle and you pull it out, and whatever the thickness is on the needle that's exposed, that's how thick your clay wall is. So I'm going to take a few measurements. You can easily see how thick the top is, so let's check a little lower. So we'll check at the base. This is where I want it the thinnest because this is going to stretch out the least. So I have it a little more than 1/4 inch. And we'll check the center. And right here I can kind of visualize it. So I do want to go a little thinner at the bottom. So I'll probably do 2 more pulls, 1 more straight pull, and then a slightly flare pull at the base, just to kind of get a nice rounded curve at the bottom to help the transition when I start flaring this out. Before I get started, I should add more slip to my hands. So get it all dirty, slipped up. And the clay is much colder now because it was blasted by AC while we were waiting. But anyway, let's go ahead and start the pull. So the bottom I can get a little thinner, so I'm going to be pushing in. And then I'm starting to push out. You can see the bump form, and then I'm going to compress the clay over there, and then do a pull. You can see that bump kind of dancing. So I'm getting to a pretty thin section over there, so I want to make sure I don't go too much thinner there. And then I'm starting to feather out the pull over here, very light pressure. And I'm just going to go through the motions here. I'm not really doing a pull, I'm just kind of stretching the clay out at the top so that I can get it prepared for the flare. Now, taking a look at my inside, it's a pretty dramatic angle change from the flat bottom swooping up. So it's not as dramatic as a 90-degree angle like I'm drawing here. It's kind of like this. There's a slight curve, but I want to get this a little more kind of outwards like that. So I'm going to do one final pull. This time it's kind of a hybrid. It's almost like a shaping pull, but I'm not going to really work on thinning the clay out. I'm just going to kind of flare it out. So this time I'm going to focus more pressure on the length of my finger to kind of tilt it outwards. Okay, so I want to make sure I'm not pushing too much. So I'm going to start the flare, or start pushing outwards. You can start seeing that kind of bump out. And I don't really need to push in very much on the outside. That hand is just kind of there to support, and I can thin out spots as needed. If you are enjoying these ceramic videos, don't forget to like and subscribe. That way it helps to grow the channel, and you'll be able to see these videos as they're released every week. Now, one thing when you start the overall shape, if this curve right here on the bottom is starting to get a little too wide too fast, you may notice that your whole piece will start to slump very, very quickly because there's a lot more weight on the top, and that curve may not be able to support the entire weight. So if you do see the clay start to slump, or this angle start to get more flat, then you do want to kind of squeeze the clay inward a little bit. And so for my liking, I probably push it out a little too much for my shaping because it's going to be pretty aggressive. So I'm going to squeeze that in a tad bit. So get my hands around the clay and then kind of push forward. So with my hands, they're going to be together like this, like a flower blooming, and I'm pushing forward just at the base and kind of lifting that up just a tad bit, just to make it more angular. So I got a little too excited on that outwards angle, little too much curve. Now it probably would have been fine, but I don't want this collapsing on me as I start shaping. And now for the shaping, I got these ribs, and basically I like shaping platters or wide bowls with two ribs, one on the inside, one on the outside. And I normally have the longer one, this one, on the outside, and the smaller one, the shorter one, on the inside. Now you don't necessarily need ribs, but I do prefer them because they will allow you to shape without adding too much water because it doesn't need too much. And the cool thing is, with two ribs, you can really compress the clay and then really bend it outwards. So I have these listed in my Amazon Marketplace if you're looking to purchase them. I do prefer this one in general if you were to buy one, because it just feels a little easier in my hands. My hands aren't the biggest. And I usually get this point gouged in my clay if this is on the inside, so this is a little more versatile. But anyway, I'm gonna have these. Now when I shape, I'm basically gonna do it like this, where this is gonna be on the outside, this is gonna be on the inside, and then I set the angle that I want by tilting this. So there's going to be a gap, so like this will be tilted. And with my inside rib, I'm pushing the clay out to then fill the gap so it touches the rib. So tilt, push, shape. Tilt, push, shape. And repeat that until I get this flared out to my liking. So I'm going to dip it in some water. And I'm going to start here at the top. So I'm going to, and one thing, when you put this on the clay wall, you don't want it perpendicular to the curve because it can skip. So you always want to angle it towards you a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to angle this towards me a little bit. And we'll start with this gap here. So I'm going to start pushing out from the top, and then you can start seeing the clay get closer and closer to the rib to close that gap. And now, right there, it's fully touching the rib for the whole entire length on the outside. And a lot of slip got taken off. And so I'm going to scratch that against the container that I have off camera. And then I'm going to keep repeating. So I'm slowly going to stretch this out wider and wider and wider until I get my flare. So now that this is more or less straight, I can actually start the flare here, set the angle that I want, and then I'm going to start pushing. So if you feel like this straight edge cannot touch the entire clay wall because it's not perfectly straight, use the round side instead. So you've set the angle, push, kind of roll this, and then move upwards. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So set the angle. And now I'm slowly sliding this tool upwards. And now my outside hand, my right hand is starting to slide up because then I need to straighten out the top section of the piece. And then right here, I'm going to start pushing out a little further to then get this top side flared. All right. As I'm doing that, I'm noticing that this curve is starting to get a little wider. It's starting to balloon. So I have to be mindful of this curve because if that pushes out too far, I am going to get a very compressed piece and this is going to kind of flop on itself. If you apply too much pressure on the top, it can also cause pressure to then go downwards and compress the bottom and having it slump. So what you can do, kind of like how we did on the bowls, is you can pre-shape the top if you want. So if you grab a sponge and your fingers and you can wet this, you can use the rib too if you want. You just kind of pre-shape this by flaring just the top out to help you get an angle. So this works too where you can start from the top down. So if you want to set the angle at the top and then you take your rib and then you kind of fill in the gap where that flare began. So that works too. And it's a little less aggressive on your piece because if you can open the top, that sets the width and the odds of it kind of getting off center is a little less. So either or. So let's start flaring the top out a little more. So now I can kind of just use the straight edge and then kind of support the rim here. If you want, you could use the curved side too. And then now it's kind of looking like a kind of a Greek planter. So I want to fill the gap that's between here to here. So I'm going to flip it around, set my angle. You see that big gap? Let's see that big gap right there? That's what I'm going to start filling. So nice and slow. And the key is slow when you start this technique. You could really flare this out really fast once you get used to it, but As you're learning it, take your time, get a feel for what your clay can handle, and then you can start getting more aggressive as you needed. All right, now this bump here is getting a little too much, so I'm going to push that in while I push the inside out. So I'm kind of inverting, pushing this in and pushing this part out. So I'm going to use this smaller one on the outside now to kind of invert this, and that's going to give extra strength to the piece. And then I'm going to go all the way up. And now my piece, I feel a little more comfortable with going more aggressive because the angles are a little better. And like I said, it's a slow process, so just take your time. We'll switch back out. Setting my angle now. And now once the clay is starting to stretch, you can actually start applying more pressure. So the beginning might be a little scary because you're getting used to what you can apply, but as you get used to the technique, you can start dialing up the pressure. Okay, so flip to the bottom, kind of clean up the inside, and let's go ahead and get that stretch going. So my eyes are looking out here at my outside hand. Okay, and the top you can flare out more so that it can kind of help your shape for the next. And you can stop whenever you're satisfied, but I'm going to get this flared out and lower so it gets a very, very wide and short. And then pressure-wise, very light pressure. My outside hand, my right hand, is barely having no pressure at all. It's just there to support the clay. My inside hand is applying all that harder pressure. Okay, set the angle again. And then just lay the rib into the wall. And you can see my rim went from about 3/4 of an inch to almost a 1/4 inch. And it's not even at the final width yet. So if you like really wide, straight-walled ramen bowls, this is how you do it. But we're going to get this even more flared. So let's keep going. So now I flipped around to using the flat side because the inside's more or less flat. And I can start covering more surface area. You can see a lot of the rib lines that I made. I can smooth that out after. But we're just trying to get this nice and wide and flat. Alright, so as you're doing this, the wider you go, the more flared out and lower it becomes, the weaker the clay will get at this very bottom section. So you have to make sure that your clay is dry enough so you can stretch it out. So the moment you start seeing it get really wonky and wobbly, make sure you dry this out by letting it spin and letting it dry naturally, or using a heat gun, a blow dryer, or a torch. And I don't need to do that just yet. And luckily I had to take that break earlier, so the clay did have some time to stiffen up a tad bit, but not much. But we'll go ahead and keep flaring until we get this to the width that we want. Okay, and then one thing, I keep saying one thing, but some other things to consider. You actively don't want to squeeze and pinch and compress the clay because that will get it overly thin, especially the top. So like I said, this is just a guide, and we're laying the clay down into the guide and we move it up. And then as I'm getting lower, it's going to get more difficult to keep this straight. So I'm going to have to angle it so that it doesn't take up as much space as I'm getting lower and lower. So it's getting closer and closer to the final height. So if you rather use your hands in shape, at least for these final parts, that's totally fine. So I'm just supporting the clay where I'm applying this pressure. I'm just making sure that the clay is not getting too soft and saggy. Okay, and then from the overhead cam, you can see that the rim is very, very wonky, and I'm not too worried about that because I'll be able to cut that to make it straight. Okay, we're gonna go a little more. And so this is the part that gets pretty scary. The angle's getting super dramatic, and so if I keep flaring this out, I may run into the chance of it slumping or collapsing on itself. So I'll probably start getting a heat gun and then kind of drying the clay a little bit so that I can flare this out a little more. So let's grab the heat gun, dry a little bit, and we'll flare it out to get this a little flatter and a little wider. I got my heat gun. This is from Amazon. The cool thing about this is you can change the temperature by rotating this dial. Right now I'll set it to around 600 degrees, and there's two settings. There's low and high. We'll put it on high, aim it at the piece, and spin the wheel slowly. So we'll get this dry. We'll do this for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then we'll start shaping. And we feel like the clay is dry enough, we will keep it at it, or we will keep shaping. All right, so we did that for about a minute. All right, so we heat gunned it for about a minute, and one thing from the inside, it's looking a little messy, so I want to go ahead and kind of smooth and compress that out. So I got the rib, let me use the rib again, and kind of like trimming, we're just kind of pushing down where you want to compress the clay and flatten it, and then it's gently scraping the top layer away, so you can see it took some away. And then we're going to want to do the same on this outside area, but I have to be very careful. If I push too far out, it's going to push the clay wall outwards, making it weaker and creating a weird angle on the bottom, which I don't want. So there's that method. The other method is wet trimming, where you can actually trim the clay away. And this does work really well. The downside is the clay will stick to itself. So if you do decide to wet trim, make sure you try to pull the trimmings off before they get stuck. So you can see that these already got a little stuck. So very easy to lose those parts. So normally what I like trying to do is, as I trim, I kind of pick the tool up before it makes a full way around. So this is also another option you can do. You can wet trim your piece. All right, so I'm going to clean up the inside, and then I will flare this out just a little bit more. So I'm not going to do too much more flare because I don't want this to collapse on myself. But we'll go ahead and compress the inside a little more. This will help get rid of those trimmings that I dropped in. And I do need to fix this transition here. So right here I have to fix that transition. So the rib is going to help me in that area. And so I'm going to get the rib, support the outside. So this bottom basically is right where my pointer finger or my ring finger is. And so I'm going to gently compress the clay. So not too much, but just enough to kind of soften that edge. And it looks like I might need to trim some of that away more. So I'm just going to kind of get that bottom a little more adjusted. And then you can now see this little weird bump here. So I'm going to trim that section away so that it has a cleaner curve going up. And then I'm going to flare this out a little more. Now the reason why I'm not just flaring it out, because the clay has to move somewhere. if there's too much in that particular spot. So if I don't trim this, it will move outwards and I'll have to trim it there. And it can cause some issues if I try to bump it out too far. So I'd rather just trim it now so that I don't have to trim as much when I actually trim it. Okay, so almost there. Take a little bit more. Alright, so I think that looks pretty good. It did create some trimming lines, so I'll go ahead and smooth that out with the rib when I do my last few flares. Okay, let's get the tools ready. And let's flare this just a little bit more. Hopefully it doesn't collapse on me. Okay, that angle does feel a little better. And I can definitely tell I need to take more off from the outside because the inside shape looks really nice. The outside has a little more of a curvedness at the base, and I want it more angled and straight. Okay, almost there. This thing is pretty flat at the base. Looks like there's a high spot here. So let's fill that in. I can see a gap between the middle of the tool. You can see on the overhead cam, it touched here and here, but not there. So that's where that outside is kind of more bumped out. So I just gotta be careful. It looks like it might collapse on me soon. Oh, there we go. It's starting to fill. All right, I think any more than this is gonna collapse. So it looks like it's already starting to collapse. You can see the rim right there. So I was pushing in a spot that wasn't very safe. So now I need to fix it, which kind of sucks. So I'm gonna heat gun this, kind of push it up, and then we're gonna call it a day. All right, let's heat gun it one more time. I'm gonna have to lift this edge up. You can see it dancing quite a bit, but we'll heat gun this. Hopefully I can lift it up and adjust the rim. So when you heat gun, you could have the rib to kind of support the plate too. As long as you're really gentle, this will actually help start pushing the shape to how it should be. So heat on the bottom. It's got to be careful not to melt the plastic. Alright, so it's still a little wobbly. I'm going to try to lift this bottom section up. This angle right here, I pushed it out too far, and I can feel it slump on one side. So I'm trying to just push it with my fingers. I can definitely feel it right there. So I'm trying to push that angle back up. And this might cause the whole piece to collapse, so hopefully it doesn't. And so I think what happened was when I was pushing down, I wasn't supporting it right here where my ring finger was. I thought the tool was there, but it wasn't, so I got slightly off. So let's see if I can fix this wobble, and then we will call it a day. So I'm trying to lift the angle up a little bit, just so it's not so flat. And it looks like it's helping. Okay, so I don't want to mess with this. The angle's pretty dramatic. I'm just going to kind of clean up the inside. Definitely got to trim that away. Got too dry. There's a little bump here. And And we are pretty much done. So let's just tidy up the inside, smooth it out. And I will need to cut the rim eventually, but the clay is a little too soft for my liking. I don't want to mess with it too much. So we'll cut the rim when this dries out a little bit more. And then we'll be done with this platter. All right, and here is the final outcome. Let's go ahead and measure it. So we got it to be about 12 3/4 wide by 3 1/4 tall out of 4 pounds of clay. And you can see that the base fairly straight. And we're going to go ahead and get this trimmed eventually. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with the outcome. It did get a little wonky. I flared it out a little too far for how wet the clay was. But in general, it is a nice narrow base, wide bowl. But I call these platters, even though some of you don't think they're called platters. But if you want to see this get trimmed, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see that video when it's released. And when we get this trimmed, I'm going to go ahead and cut this when it's drier so it doesn't sag on me, and show the best way to trim something as big as this. So make sure you stick around and check your notifications to see that video. And of course, I want to say mahalo to all the Mud Club members who have been supporting this channel. And if you would like to become one and you are unsure what we have to offer, check the description below. It has all the details there. And until next week, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.